And I see people are starting to join, so some people found their way over. Ah, wonderful. Natalie, is it still convenient for you to run the slide presentation, or would you rather that Laura or I do that?
We have a couple slides ahead of it, so I can do that, but I'll just have it in a smaller window, and then we will go from there. All right.
Okay.
So thank you all. There are a couple people who are trickling in. Hopefully we can get more, or we can all go off the recording. So thank you for your patience as we're dealing with a couple technical glitches here. Really excited to have this webinar and get everybody a chance to hear from Dr. Strawn and Dr. McEntire about this topic. So if you give me 1 second there to get all of these pieces moving together. All right, so is ice pack produce risky business? Jill?
All righty, hello everyone. All right, hello everyone. And again, we want to apologize for the technical glitch. If we're looking for someone to blame that on, that would be me because I pushed the wrong button. Anyway, we do hope most of you have gotten the new message. This presentation will be recorded, and we're going to be rushing a bit because we know we've gotten behind. My name is Jill Hollingsworth. I'm with Ecolab, and my primary focus is on retail food safety issues and topics that are current. And we try to do these webinar series to get really timely information on things that we know are impacting retailers. This is our antitrust statement. I'm sure you've seen this on many webinars, and while I've been talking, I'm sure you've all read it thoroughly. So let's move on. Next slide. We also want to thank our food safety partners at National Grocers Association. We work hand in hand with NGA on food safety, and they also work with us to bring you these webinars, which are part of an ongoing series. And with that, I am going to turn this over to my colleague and co-host, Natalie Seymour, who will introduce our speakers, and we'll get rolling. Again, our apologies for the glitch we had getting started up today. With that, Natalie, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you all again for your patience with Jill. For the sake of time, I'll do a brief introduction. So we are honored to have Dr. Jennifer McEntire, who is the founder and president of Food Safety Strategy, and Dr. Laura Strawn, who is extension professional out of Virginia Tech. And with that, I will let you guys get to your content, and we will go from there. Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, well, I think I get to start. So welcome, everyone. It wouldn't be, a typical week if we didn't have something technology, a big fail, but we're here. And so we really wanted to start with just giving you an overview of a paper that Jen and I wrote on ice produce and looking at practical risk management guidance. And of course, with my job in extension and research, I get to go out to the field, see a bunch of different things. And then Jen she's on the consulting side now instead of the trade association world. And so this really was a lot of collaborative work with the industry and various partners. So we thank them, and we'll go ahead and get started. So next slide. We're going to skip our fun polls because we're not going to have any fun yet, maybe a little later. But like I mentioned, and I will put this in the chat, but this entire presentation is really the architect or the foundation for it is a food protection trends management article. It's free to download. I will give it to everyone. It has a lot of nice visuals, but really does a good job in illustrating a lot of the concepts if you need to do insight trainings. and as well have those conversations with inspectors or auditors on ICE produce and what you do with that. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so like I said, this talk is going to be a little bit high level, but we really want to get to all the good stuff. Again, the full article is in Food Protection Trends, and we're going to get into that. So top icing produce or top icing, it's common for commodities like broccoli, leafy greens, corn, various others. The ice helps maintain moisture and temperature control. But this also can create a bit of a wet environment, right? Where certain things like maybe hazards like Listeria monocytogenes could thrive. And so that's why we really want to focus in on some of our rigorous sanitation and really think through some of these different cross-contamination points and what we can do. So this article, of course, is going to go through that and talk about the different hazards that you want to look at, different factors that are going to influence them, and then as well mitigations. So let's do the next slide. So we, of course, have an architect out for you all, but we'll talk a little bit about, why ice produce presents a unique challenge, right? Clearly, melting ice can make a big mess, right? Water can take a small problem and make it quite large. And we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory expectations and context, and some practical strategies to control these hazards in our distribution centers and warehouses. Or this really could be applied to anywhere outside of it, but the paper was written in the construct of distribution centers and warehouses. So let's get to the next slide. Okay, so we know that the benefits of using ice they're pretty self-explanatory, right? It's going to preserve our freshness, extend shelf life. We've used it for decades now, and it's a great way to keep our produce looking crisp, looking fresh, right? Elongate that shelf life, delay spoilage, and it's also fairly low cost cooling method compared to some of the other alternatives. So I think that's why we keep using it. But there obviously is some challenges that come with using ice. Challenge number one is just managing the meltwater and cross-contamination. And these risks can be compounded, right, by different temperature fluctuations, pallet stacking, pallet slotting, what kinds of facilities that we're in terms of drainage, and so forth. So we'll kind of touch on a little bit of all these different factors. And then again, some of those we'll get to the rubber meets the road. Like, what do you do, right? What are the mitigations? So before we do that, let's do the next slide and talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape. And this is also where I'll be passing it off soon to Jen. But in terms of, where ICE and everything falls, it's going to fall under the regulatory confines of the Food Safety Modernization Act. For those that are suppliers, right, that are bringing this product into the facilities, likely if they're produce, they're going to fall under the produce safety rule, and they're going to start with ice that's basically free of contamination, right? They're using ice if it's directly contacting the product that's going to have no detectable generic E. coli in their water. They're going to make sure that this ice has been properly stored, that it's in clean containers, and they're making sure on that front end. And then, of course, when we get into the warehouse, that is where we start to kind of flip into a different regulatory context. And of course, I could tell you about it, but I could also let the expert do it too. So Jen, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Laura. We'll move to the next slide. So yeah, if you are a registered facility, that includes warehouses, it includes distribution centers, as well as the manufacturers and processors, then you're under the preventive controls rule, and probably don't have to tell you, you have to do the hazard analysis, evaluation, identify what those potential hazards are, and then make a decision based on risk. Is a preventive control needed or not? So we'll move to the next slide and we'll kind of walk through in the context of ice produce, what are the hazards? At what point do they become risks that need to be more actively managed? And so just a illustration from the article, you've got produce, it's got ice on it, it may be stacked above other produce. And so we can see that there's the potential for some dripping that's going down from one product to another, from one bin to another. And then there's also the water itself that's then within the operation, and kind of what happens to it, what are associated hazards and risks. So next slide, please. We cite the hazard that people probably view top of mind, and some may view it as a risk, Listeria monocytogenes. You're in an environment that is cold because you have ice. You want to try to keep it ice. It's water, though. It melts. So those cool, damp environments are exactly what we think of when we're thinking about conditions where L. mono may outcompete, may be able to grow and establish itself. So uh, thinking about the flooring, the cracks, transportation in and out of these areas, and not surprisingly, when people have looked in distribution centers in particular, they can find, in some circumstances, they can find evidence of listeria in those drains, in the coolers, in these refrigerated areas. They're cool, they're damp, they may not have that daily sanitation that a manufacturing processing environment has. And so it's not a surprise that you can occasionally find listeria. The question is, at what point does it become a risk to the product? And how do we start to think about the role that ice and ice produce may play in this? Next slide, please. So a few things that will, before I move on the listeria path, also, contamination, just cross-contamination, as we saw in the illustration, the ice that's dripping down, it's melting and it's going through product, it's going through packaging, it may be going through pallets. I don't know that I would want to drink pallet water. And so think about how clean are your pallets? What might be on those pallets that if stacked one above another bin, what might be dripping off, through the product, off that pallet, and then into the product that sits below it. Next slide, please. So as we think about when does that hazard become a risk that may require a control, there are several questions that we'll want to ask ourselves. The first is, just how much water are we talking about? Can we keep the ice in the state of ice and not transitioning to the state of water melting? So what is the temperature? How well is temperature controlled? How cold can we make this room, make this aisle, to try to limit the amount of water that we have to deal with? If we do have to deal with water, then how is it being managed? Do we have drainage in this area? Do we have pans that are going to be diverting melted ice, moving that water toward a drain, or is it just kind of puddling and pooling? We can also ask, are we stacking? So do we have one product on top of another where ice may be dripping down? And if so, what exactly are those products? So do we have any rules around this to say that if it's a ready-to-eat product on the bottom, it has to be a ready-to-eat product on the top? Has the ice that's been applied, is it even subject to the produce safety rule? Is that product subject to the produce safety rule? Or might we have a circumstance where we've got a product on top with ice that was not subject to the PSR? It's rarely consumed raw, perhaps the sweet corn, and that ice then is dripping down onto a product that is likely to be consumed raw, that would be considered ready to eat. We'll also want to ask ourselves, do we have any sort of barriers, any sort of packaging, plastic covers that may be able to move the water in the direction we want, but also protect the product that it's covering? And then what is the state of sanitation, maintenance within this facility? How often is this room, is this area cleaned, sanitized? What is the traffic in and out? So just kind of understanding the type of environment that we're working in. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure that we're not able to do the poll, but I'm going to go through, actually, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, of those things that I mentioned, what are you interested? Where do you see the greatest challenges? So is it in that temperature fluctuation? Is it in the what's stacked above what? Is it in the just management of drains, management of water? If you can tell us in the chat sort of what you're most concerned about, the packaging, the sanitation, something else, or none of them. Maybe this is not applicable to you. We'd definitely be interested in your feedback that way. But moving on to the next slide, so what do we do about this? In an ideal world, there would be no ice produce, right? We would use alternative cooling methods. And for some products and in some regions, there are those opportunities. But fact of the matter is, for the foreseeable future, we're probably going to have to deal with some amount of ice. As long as we're dealing with ice, then, can we maintain colder temperatures? Can we bump that temperature down a notch or two to try to keep it as frozen? Can we train employees? Can we look at moving those products maybe from the loading dock into the cold room, that wet aisle, more quickly to limit the amount of melting that occurs? Can we reevaluate sanitation on a routine basis as well as master sanitation schedules to try to limit the amount of water that's being tracked, that's being pooled, where organisms, including pathogens, may be able to survive or grow? Next slide, please. Can we implement a drain system? I think we're back 2 slides, please. Can we implement digging out drains is easier said than done. But I do know of facilities that have, as they're expanding, evaluated the opportunities to build brand new rooms, brand new aisles just to manage their iced produce. So maybe it started off in a room that was not designed to handle that volume of water, but as they're building, then they can build in drains, channels to manage water. Can you use shrouds or liners to protect produce from that dripping water? And I see, some comments in the chat of, trying to look at drip pans. Yes, as long as they're maintained, as long as they are continued to be can be cleaned. Bagging the pallets, does that create a mess? Sometimes I've seen where water starts to pool on that bagging. So how do we make sure that we're diverting the right way, water the right way, if we are using these types of barriers? And then, perhaps also another pipe dream is implementing single stacked pallets. So not having stacking above, not having the opportunity for water to drip, putting other things on those higher levels. Obviously, it may become inefficient from a space standpoint to only have a single layer, but can we think about how we're organizing our space to try to limit those opportunities for water to drip down? And I see the comment, yeah, we don't have the space for single level slotting, right? But can you put something else above that may not drip down? And logistically, this may not be realistic. Next slide, please. If you also want to put in the chat, which of these do you think is the most feasible or least? Different things work for different people. If you have come up with creative solutions, this would be a great opportunity to share some of the things that you've done that have been effective from a food safety standpoint, and also perhaps from an auditor standpoint, which may not be the same. They may not be using the same types of measures and making those evaluations of adequacy. Next slide, please. So the cumulative measures, thinking about this not as a one-off solution, but as a multiple hurdle approach, can we concurrently lower temperature, make sure that we're stacking appropriately when we have to stack, make sure that the alignment of those stacks is getting the water, if it's going to drip, that it's dripping at least where we want, which is not onto other product versus pallets. Sometimes they get messed up. The forklifts may not move them exactly where you want them to be. And this could create drips in all sorts of directions. And then have we worked with sanitation to establish what is an appropriate master sanitation schedule? How often can, whether it is a room, an aisle, even just a couple of those slots, how often can they be cleaned out so that they can be appropriately cleaned and sanitized? Next, please. So I don't think that ice produce is going away. It does serve a purpose, but it also can create some challenges just because of the amount of water and the associated risks, contamination, moving from one type of product to another, through pallets sometimes, through your racking systems. But I'm not sure that in every instance this warrants like a crisis response. These are things that can be managed if you're attentive and you think through the questions that we asked, the items that we've discussed, starting with who is your supplier and what is the likelihood that that product is contaminated, that the water used to make ice is contaminated, making sure that you have that shored up, looking at the nature of your racking, the nature of your pallets, and thinking about what may be dripping, and working with your facility and your team. So we've talked about hazards. Just because it's a hazard doesn't mean that it's a risk. That's pretty situation specific. And I think that you can be systematic in justifying your decision of whether a preventive control is needed or not. Really think about, from the product's perspective, what is it experiencing and when might ice produce and the factors around it elevate that hazard to the level where the risk does warrant a control. I see that another comment is the availability of iceless produce being an option. Yeah, increasingly it is. And this is another area where you can push back on, I wouldn't say push back, have a conversation with your suppliers and ask them if there are some other options or perhaps consider looking at some alternate suppliers. Next slide, please. I think that we have zipped on through this, and we're happy to take some questions. Laura, as was mentioned, as many of you know Laura from Virginia Tech, but she is also a friend and fan of food safety strategy, and it was wonderful collaborating with her on this document. So with that, Jill, Natalie, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. We're monitoring the chat and the Q&A, so if you have additional questions, we would love to be able to have that conversation now. Currently, there is a question about whether or not the recording will be available, and yes, it will be available. We'll make sure it gets out to everybody. And going through here, if you have a question that you would like to ask the presenters, if you wouldn't mind throwing it in the Q&A form, that will help us make sure that we get it and not have it get lost in some of the other conversation. We will definitely be sending out the full recording to make sure that everyone gets all the content. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties there. So while we are waiting then, is there anything that you all wanted to add to the conversation? I know we were trying to make sure things stayed brief because of our pivot here. Is there anything that you wanted to add to the conversation earlier on that you maybe skipped over while we're waiting on some other questions?
Just one thing I want to reiterate what Laura had said early on for those who joined a little bit later is that everything that we've talked about here is based on an article that was in Food Protection Trends. And so if you missed any of our talk, if we moved through pretty quickly, there's more detail, and Laura had just put the link to that article into the chat. So check it out. There's some very pretty pictures in there that try to illustrate some of the different scenarios that people may want to consider when evaluating risk.
A great point here. And while this isn't formatted as a question, I would love to hear your thoughts on this comment that's in the chat. So Michelle has written, we really need scientific documentation on what the real risks are on agricultural products that are required to be washed by the consumer. And so required to be washed is kind of that language of what we're expecting. I've yet to see an outbreak on ice produce. Can you all comment on that and where the data is on the epidemiology and what we're dealing with as far as what's considered required to be washed, generally not eaten raw, etc.?
So I can start, Laura, and I want to make sure that I understand the question because actually I think we have some other articles on other articles on the topic of and have had a lot of discussion on what is required to be washed, because from a preventive control standpoint within the preventive controls rule, there is a definition of ready to eat, and ready to eat includes items that can be consumed raw without any further preparation. And so when I was working at United Fresh Produce Association and then International Fresh Produce Association, really tried to work with the produce industry to get them to recognize that just because you want a consumer to wash something doesn't mean they will. And the expectation, I think, especially in this day and age, is that when the food is being grown, harvested, packed, you have to ensure food safety then, and you cannot rely on a consumer's handling of that food to mitigate any risk. We also know from a scientific standpoint, if a product is contaminated, it's very difficult to wash all those pathogens off. So prevention, focusing on prevention early in the supply chain is key versus looking at washing, especially washing by consumers, which, I mean, personally, I'll say it's more like rinsing, right? So I'm not sure that that's an effective risk reduction measure. Even though FDA and CDC continue to say, wash your produce before you eat it, I think that it feels good to do that. But I don't know of any studies that have evaluated the case studies that have evaluated the epi on when people have become ill versus not become ill because they've washed contaminated produce. I do believe that there are outbreaks associated with produce that has been iced. It may not be evident to the consumer because when you go to the grocery store, you may not see that product still being on ice, but through the supply chain, it may have been iced. And the one that's top of mind to me, and I cannot guarantee that the outbreaks associated with this commodity were always iced, but cilantro is something that is ordinarily iced, and we've had plenty of outbreaks associated with cilantro. Did ice play a role in those outbreaks? I don't think so. They didn't contribute the initial contamination is my suspicion that happened earlier, but could it have exacerbated any of the cross-contamination? Perhaps. We simply don't know. And I'm not aware, I don't know if Laura is aware of any studies that have really looked at some of the outbreaks from the standpoint of the role that ice may have played.
Yeah, it's something that in the research community we've talked about a lot of, but I don't think I know of anybody that's actually done a study on that. I think what we all worry about, like you said, is amplification, right, of something that might be there, making it worse. So, I mean, to me, that's where my fears with all the ice and the water and the residual moisture come in. So I think prevention is still the best, right? So prevent it from getting contaminated in the first place. You're going to definitely have the best shot. And then we really want to make sure we don't amplify throughout the supply chain. So and all the different things that we do, right? But in terms of a research study, it is out there.
Hey everyone, this is Jill again. I wondered if when they were looking at the transportation rules, has it ever come up as an issue when that product is being loaded onto trucks and transported? I don't know if you would know or not, if the temperatures in the trucks are cold enough so that they don't have a lot of melting and dripping in the trucks. But do you know if that problem starts, way back before it even gets to the distribution center, or does it come in pretty much not melted at all, and it's their time spent in the coolers that really causes that dripping and possible cross-contamination?
I'll start by speaking about the sanitary transportation rule, which was, and I think FDA is pretty well acknowledged that they wrote that rule to be fairly well aligned with industry best practice. It's not terribly prescriptive. It does have a call out for foods that require temperature control for safety, but that term is not defined. FDA doesn't define what are foods that require temperature control for safety, and notably didn't cross-reference food code. So it's not that would have been kind of made life easy, right? But they didn't. So it's up to the supply chain to determine if that's synonymous with food code or if it's not. Other than that, it is the way the rule is written. These are my words, not FDA's. But the way the rule is written is that it's up to supply chain partners to agree. It's up to the supplier that's shipping the product to determine what conditions are necessary. If there is some specific temperature, it's up to them to establish that temperature and then work with the transporter to ensure that they instruct the transporter to hit that temperature. But FDA doesn't, within the rule, it's really not prescriptive. And I think this is a good area that you've identified, Jill, where when we're talking about ice produce, maybe these types of products are ones that deserve a little bit more attention and deserve a bit more detail in terms of instructing the transporters about the temperatures needed to try to minimize how much ice melts. We know that from a practical standpoint, if you especially have LTL and those doors are opening and shutting, you're probably going to have a lot of temperature fluctuation that could prompt ice to melt. Understanding what are those temperatures in your supply chain, I think could be helpful in figuring this out. And I've worked with some distributors who also make their own ice so that if the product comes in and too much is melted, then they're adding more ice on top because so much is melted. So it does suggest to me, Jill, that there are temperature fluctuations through the supply chain that are contributing, in some cases, a substantial amount of melting. And that's a lot of water and it's a lot of weight.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder that we are in the Q&A section and you can put your questions in the question function. I'm also monitoring the chat if that is more easily accessible.
And I continue to get some questions about being able to access this webinar. We will share the recording. Again, we are definitely sorry about the glitch at the beginning. My fault. I take all the credit and blame for that. Nevertheless, we did record everything. So we will be sure that if you missed the first couple of slides, we'll be sure you get the full recording and can watch this again from start to finish. Anything else? I wonder if, since the poll wasn't working, is it of value to go back? There was one question, I think, very early in the poll that we just skipped through those. Could we go back to any of those questions and have people respond now that we have so many in the chat to see if people might want to respond to some of those earlier questions.
Jen, Laura, I'll defer to you.
Oh.
I don't see the questions back up. The slides. Can we get those back?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we need.
Yeah, I think anybody can ask anything. I'll just throw it out. We could just do potpourri style. That's like the only fair thing to do since we did not really actually start on time. I think Kristen asks in the chat, it seems to me that there are potential issues throughout the supply chain. Yep, right. We know it's start to finish, right? We have to stay vigilant. What are ways that a farmer can help ensure that their product is kept safe after it leaves their farm? That's such a good one, right? And I think, well, okay, I'm not the traceability person, but we do have somebody who does know a lot about it. But I do think as we start to now like have a better sense of where things are going and coming, I think that's going to help us, right? And that you'll be able to kind of work with good suppliers and then not only like, making sure you get it from really good farms, but farms are sending it to really good places. I guess I think it goes both ways, but maybe Jen, you want to chime in with what you think on this one.
I couldn't agree more. And it was one of the areas where, as traceability began to evolve and improve, I think some of those companies earlier in the supply chain did see the opportunity to better understand what is happening to their product, especially if they're getting complaints from their customers to say, well, what really happened here? And I know Kristen clarified that, she's specifically regarding the melting of ice. There's the temp tails, tracking of temperatures that you can start to get more visibility onto not just where is your product physically going, but how long is it spending under certain conditions, trying to see if those temperatures have fluctuated. But I've often said that traceability is a byproduct of good record keeping, and good record keeping and data more broadly, it becomes very useful. If you start to tie all these things together, it can give some insights, whether it's times of year, number of stops, the duration of that haul. I think there's maybe some opportunities to optimize within the system to try to minimize the melting of ice.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think you hit it with the loggers, right? Monitoring, right? Like, so if you're a farm and you have your product and it's the best perfect product and it leaves, making sure that you can figure out, how quickly, what's going on in terms of the time and the temperatures. And I think some of those tail records and some of the new products that are out on the market now with all of our technology can really help to determine that, right? And that way, if you're seeing things where it's this really long duration or you see spikes, that's where we start to see some of our issues, I think. So. Oh, that's an interesting one. So okay. So guidance on how much ice should be applied to commodities. This one, wow. In terms of, I went down a rabbit hole for research on this, right? And because it's never really applied from a safety perspective, it's always quality, right? It seems like more is better, but I would say that a lot of times it's really honestly what the package integrity can hold. That's kind of what we saw. There are calculations. We did find this in our research on a certain amount of product, needs this amount of ice to keep it cool. There's some really sophisticated models out there that go way beyond me. I'd have to call up my friend Don Schaffner, who I think was on earlier. But I think when it comes to this, I think that most of the time from just observation, a lot of it is it's a lot of covering it to what the package can hold, right? I don't think they're doing precise calculations per box, but Jen, you can tell me if you see anything different. But just kind of like a snow cone flurry.
Yeah, I don't see that anyone is measuring their ice down to the gram. But we have to bear in mind that produce is, it's alive. Different commodities respire at different rates, and so they themselves may continue to generate heat. The suppliers generally know this, and may pack the product differently, may ice the product differently if for different commodities, knowing the respiration rates.
So I like this question. And then, yeah, Jill, that's a good one about the different controls that we list out. And we certainly give like 10 different options, right? Because there's no one perfect option. But I guess maybe we'll say, I'll change the question. Jen, do you see any that are maybe more promising that others are adopting more or trying to do in terms of ice and controlling their water management?
I have yet to see a perfect solution, one that I view as perfect or that the facility, the operation views as perfect. Um, people often try drip pans, but can find them very difficult to maintain, to not just build up a slime on that drip pan. So you're taking a bad situation and maybe making it worse. Uh, Having some sort of physical barrier, but a removable, like a liner, some sort of cover, is one that becomes, depending on the product, people manage it that way, I think, to a reasonable degree. But a lot of the challenge that I see is just in having sufficient drains to handle the amount of water that's coming down, and having those drains accessible to sanitation, so not like in between the back to back of racks, where then you can't really get into it unless that slot is totally empty. So having uh, better drainage, trying to direct the water, and having sanitation around drip those drip pans, if they exist, are some of the ways that those are the most common ways that I see to manage things.
Yeah, it's a challenging one, right? You put up some sort of kind of engineering marvel, and then you have to figure out like, how am I going to clean it? I think the ones that I like to see, and of course this is like, someone's going to be like, Laura, you're academic, you just said make a new cold storage room. But I think the ones that where they have the new drainage, the segregated rooms for the ice product, and they can kind of like keep it all together, certainly is helpful. But yeah, I mean, investing in drainage is probably a key one, right, to contain the water, and then sanitation, right, and then I would say like worker training, right, just like in terms of like pallet stacking and slotting, which I know is easier said than done because things are moving really fast in and out of the warehouses. But if you see things shifted over, you see things dripping, having that culture where you can have it to alert the right person that can do something about it. So, but I think it's going to take a hurdle technology, which is your cumulative slide. So, and then, yeah, someone mentioned bags can reduce shelf life of product. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen those bags. That's probably not the best, especially when they burst. Any other questions? I feel like it's a couple minutes. Can someone stump Jen?
Thanks, Laura.
What are friends for? No, I'm kidding. But
right.
But I mean, for everybody, the article has everything you need, and I think our emails are on the slide as well. So we're both very good with response to email. And like I said, the article kind of lists out sort of a laundry list of different things for you to pick and choose from, or at least consider. And I would like to say, I think if you go through all of those, you'll have a much more successful conversation, hopefully, right, with your inspector, your auditor, whoever is in there, because you've already thought through all these different things, and you're ready, right, with your defensible positions.
Laura and Jen, this is Jill again. Have you seen whether or not there is something of a regional and seasonal use of ice to top this product. In cold weather, do we see a reduction in it, or does it not make any difference what the ambient temperature is? It's still a matter of they need ice to keep the fresh look. And when I was talking to some retailers about this a while ago, one or two did tell me they don't get ice top poultry, and it did seem to be more of a regional thing. Have you seen anything like that?
It does seem to be regional in terms of the production area. So some production areas tend to use ice more. If there's seasonality associated with that, then yeah, you would see a time of year impact too. But that might just be an artifact of when that region is actually producing.
Thanks. Anything else?
All right, as we wrap up here, last call for a quick question. But as we're double checking to see if there's anything else, I just want to ask that you join me in thanking Dr. McEntire and Dr. Strawn for taking the time to break this down for us. Again, the recording will be available. They're extremely helpful if you reach out with questions. And so definitely take the time to read through the article, go through the recording, reach out, and if there's anything that I can help you with as well, and getting some answers for you, happy to do so. So since I don't see any final questions, thank you again from us. Very much appreciated, and hope everyone has a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.